Margaret grew up in a small town in Ohio, where life seemed simple on the outside but carried unspoken struggles underneath. She was the quiet girl with curious eyes, the one who spent hours sketching trees on scraps of paper and dreaming of places beyond the horizon. She loved the thought of painting city streets she had never walked on and oceans she had never seen. Art became her secret language, her way of expressing feelings she couldn't put into words. Her home life was steady but filled with unspoken rules. Dreams were nice, but they didn't put food on the table. Her parents reminded her often to think practically, to prepare for marriage and family, not adventure. Margaret listened, nodded, and hid her sketches in drawers. Still, she carried hope in her heart that one day she could live differently. At 19, everything changed. She met William, a tall, charming young man who had a smile that made her feel safe. He worked at the local factory and had dreams of stability. He was practical, focused, and grounded in a way that contrasted Margaret's wandering spirit. Their romance was fast and intense, letters filled with promises, walks under the stars, and late-night talks about their future. For Margaret, it felt like the kind of love she had always wanted, something secure to hold on to. But behind her laughter and her new love, Margaret carried something she rarely spoke of. Her childhood had left her with scars, not visible but heavy in her heart. She had known fear too young, had felt the weight of silence when she should have felt protection. She didn't tell William everything. Instead, she convinced herself that love would be enough to heal what she couldn't name. She wanted to start over, to bury the shadows of her past and step into a brighter future with him. Marriage came quickly. At 20, she became Margaret Bennett, a wife who cooked dinners, folded laundry, and decorated their small home with flowers from the backyard. On the surface, she looked like any young bride smiling, learning to manage the responsibilities of adulthood. But late at night, when the house grew still, she would sit by the window with her sketchbook, drawing softly by the dim light. The dreams she once shouted inside her heart had now become whispers. William was kind, hardworking, and devoted, but he was also practical to the core. To him, art was a sweet hobby, something nice but not necessary. He encouraged her to focus on being a good wife and, later, a good mother. Margaret didn't argue. She smiled and agreed. She loved him too much to fight, and she loved her children even more when they came along. Motherhood filled her days with joy and responsibility. But it also silenced the part of her that longed for something more. The invisible wound inside her grew heavier over time. She found herself longing for freedom, not from her family, but from the memories she had locked away. Sometimes, she looked at her children playing in the yard and promised herself they would never carry the same shadows she did. That thought kept her strong. Still, her old dream lingered quietly. The brushes she had once used with so much passion now gathered dust in a box under her bed. She told herself it was foolish to think about painting when life demanded so much from her. And yet, every now and then, when the children were asleep and William had gone to bed, she would lift the lid of that box, run her fingers across the brushes, and feel her heart ache with longing. Margaret's silence became part of her identity. To her neighbors, she was the warm, dependable young woman who always offered a kind word. To her family, she was the glue that held everything together. But deep inside, she carried a quiet storm, a mix of old pain and buried dreams. She wanted to heal, to express, to create. But fear kept her still. The turning point came one late evening when she sat alone at the kitchen table. A sketchbook lay open before her, untouched for weeks. The moonlight streamed through the window, soft and silver, and she found herself sketching again. First a tree, then a house, then a figure standing alone under a sky full of stars. She didn't realize it at the time, but she was drawing herself small, quiet, and waiting for something greater. That night, she whispered to herself, "There has to be more than silence." It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't anger. It was a gentle acknowledgement that the little girl who once dreamed of colors and canvases was still alive inside her. She didn't yet know how or when she would return to that dream. But for the first time in years, Cute let herself believe it wasn't gone. Margaret didn't share this with anyone, not even William. To him, life was about paying bills, raising children, and keeping the house running smoothly. She respected his vision of life, but hers was different. While he sought stability, she sought meaning. While he focused on survival, she longed for expression. And so her silence continued. But now it carried a spark, a hidden promise she made to herself. Her story was only beginning, though she didn't know it then. She was still the young wife, still the mother with endless responsibilities, still the woman hiding a quiet heartache. But she had started something important. She had picked up the pen again, if only for a night. And that single act, small as it seemed, was the first step toward the healing she would one day find. The truth was simple. Margaret carried both love and sorrow, both stability and longing. She had built a life she was grateful for, but she also carried dreams she could no longer ignore. The silence she had lived with for so long was about to change, and so, part one of her story ends not with a grand event, but with a quiet moment to woman, a sketchbook, and a promise to herself that she would one day live beyond her silence. Margaret's 30s arrived. It's like a storm she didn't see coming. Her children were growing, the house was always alive with noise, and William worked long hours at the factory. Life looked steady from the outside, but inside their marriage, cracks began to form. William loved her deeply, but he lived in the world of numbers and paychecks, while Margaret lived in the world of colors and emotions. They loved each other, yet they often spoke different languages. One summer afternoon, after the children had gone to bed, Margaret pulled out her old box of paints. The smell of oil and turpentine filled the room, and something inside her woke up. She spread colors across the canvas in a rush, painting not landscapes or flowers, but feeling swirls of blue and red, shadows of gray, sparks of gold. It was as if she was finally letting her soul breathe. She didn't notice William come in until his voice broke the silence. "What's all this?" he asked, his tone curious but weary. "It's just painting," she replied, almost embarrassed, brushing her hair back from her face. William stepped closer and looked at the canvas. "It's nice," he said flatly, then added, "but don't stay up too late. You'll be tired tomorrow." His words weren't cruel, but they cut deep. To him, art was a pastime, like knitting or gardening. To her, it was life itself. Margaret said nothing, but inside she felt a mixture of disappointment and determination. She couldn't make him understand, but she also couldn't stop. Weeks turned into months, and painting became her secret refuge. After the children were asleep, she would slip into the spare room, light a small lamp, and paint until her eyes grew heavy. She painted storms, sunsets, and faceless figures that carried pieces of her soul. Each canvas told the truth she couldn't say aloud. She was carrying both love and sorrow, both joy and pain. But secrets don't stay hidden forever. One evening, William found a stack of her finished paintings leaning against the wall. He picked one up, a canvas filled with sharp strokes of blue and streaks of red. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked. "It's how I feel," she answered softly. He stared at it for a moment, then sighed. "Margaret, you've got too much to do to waste time on feelings. The kids need you. I need you. This isn't real life." His words broke her heart, not because he meant to hurt her, but because he didn't see her. She loved him, yet she felt invisible. That night she cried quietly in the dark, careful not to wake him. She wanted to be the perfect wife, but she also wanted to be herself. The two felt impossible to balance. Still, she didn't give up. If anything, his disapproval made her stronger. She learned to carve out little moments of freedom, a quick sketch while dinner simmered on the stove, a splash of paint before the children came home from school. She hid canvases under the bed, behind closets, anywhere they wouldn't be questioned. She wasn't rebelling. She was surviving, yet the distance between her and William grew. Their conversations became shorter, their laughter less frequent. He worked late. She painted late. They shared a home, a bed, a family, but sometimes it felt like they lived in two different worlds. And still she loved him. She admired his strength, his devotion, his steady hands. But she longed for him to see her not just as a wife and mother, but as a woman with dreams. One autumn evening, they argued for the first time in years. It wasn't shouting, but the kind of quiet disagreement that lingers. William had come home exhausted, his face lined with worry about bills. He saw her paints on the table again and shook his head. "You don't understand how hard this is," he said. "We can't afford distractions. Life isn't about chasing dreams, it's about surviving." Margaret looked at him with tears in her eyes. "And what about living, William? What about feeling alive?" The silence that followed was heavier than any words. For the first time, Margaret realized that love wasn't always enough to fill the space between two people. That night, when she thought he was asleep, William reached for her hand. His grip was gentle, almost apologetic. Without looking at her, he whispered, "I know you carry something I cannot fix, but don't let it take your joy." The words stunned her. For years, she thought he ignored her pain, but maybe he had seen it all along. Maybe he didn't know how to respond. Her heart softened, and for a moment, she felt understood. She realized William wasn't her enemy. He was just a man shaped by practicality, trying to keep his family safe. Still, the truth remained, she could no longer bury her dreams. She loved her family, but she also needed to love herself. From that day on, Margaret made a quiet decision. She would no longer paint in secret. She wouldn't shout it to the world, but she would stop hiding. Her art was part of her healing, part of her survival, and she would not abandon it again. And though she didn't know it yet, this choice, the decision to honor her dreams in small but steady ways, would change the course of her life. It would test her marriage, challenge her strength, and eventually lead her toward the healing she had always longed for. For now, though she stood in the middle of her kitchen, her brushes in one hand, her husband's words in her mind, and her heart caught between love and longing, she was no longer the silent girl she once was. She was becoming someone new, someone braver. And though the road ahead would be full of, Margaret was 50 when life began to shift in a way she never expected. Her children were grown, living their own lives, and the house felt quieter than ever. For years, she had hidden her art, painting only at night or when no one was around. But now, with her days less crowded, the silence pressed against her, urging her to face what she had always avoided. One morning, she walked past the library bulletin board in town and noticed a small flyer, "Community Art Group, all ages welcome." She stood staring at it, her heart racing. For a moment, she told herself it wasn't for her. She was too old, too out of practice. Art groups were for young people, for dreamers still chasing their futures. But the thought wouldn't leave her. That evening, she went back and tore the flyer down, folding it neatly into her purse. The first meeting terrified her. She almost turned back at the door, clutching her paints like a child with a secret. But when she stepped inside, she was surprised. The room was filled with people of all kinds, teenagers with messy hair, young adults in paint-stained shirts, even a few retirees with wrinkled hands but bright eyes. No one looked at her strangely. They welcomed her, asked her name, offered her a chair. When she began to paint that night, something inside her broke open. She no longer had to hide. She painted freely, bold strokes across the canvas, her hands trembling but alive. The others watched quietly, and when she finally stepped back, a young woman said, "Your work feels like healing." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in decades, someone had seen her not as a mother, not as a wife, but as an artist. Week after week, she returned. Each session gave her strength. She painted her memories, her fears, her silent years. She painted storms of blue that spoke of sorrow, sunsets of gold that whispered hope, and faceless figures that carried pieces of her past. She was not painting for perfection. She was painting to survive. Her confidence grew slowly. At first, she hesitated to share her work, but the group encouraged her. They asked questions, listened to her stories, and told her she had something unique. Their words gave her courage. She realized that art was not just about beauty, was about truth. And her truth mattered. William noticed the change in her. He would watch her leave the house with her paints, a lightness in her step he hadn't seen in years. At first he said nothing. He didn't understand this new part of her life, but he couldn't ignore how it softened her. The bitterness that once lingered between them began to fade. She smiled more. She hummed while cooking dinner. She laughed with him in small ways she hadn't in years. When the art group announced a small gallery showing, Margaret was terrified. She wanted to hide her work, afraid it wasn't good enough. But the group insisted she display her paintings. "People need to see your story," one of them told her. Against her fears, she agreed. The night of the showing, Margaret stood in the gallery surrounded by her canvases. The walls glowed with her storms and her sunsets, her shadows and her light. Strangers walked through the room, pausing to study her work. Some tilted their heads, some whispered, some even wiped their eyes. Each reaction filled her with a strange mix of fear and joy. William stood quietly by her side, his hands in his pockets. He had always been practical, steady, focused on the real world. But as he looked at her paintings, something changed in his eyes. He stopped in front of one canvas's swirl of dark blue with a single streak of gold cutting through it. He stared for a long time, then finally spoke. "I never knew how much you were carrying," he whispered. Margaret felt her chest tighten. For years, she had longed for him to see her. And now, in this moment, he did. His words weren't dramatic, but they were enough. They carried understanding, compassion, and a quiet love she thought had been lost. That evening, when the gallery closed and they walked home together, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. For the first time, she wasn't just a wife, a mother, or a grandmother. She was herself an artist, a woman, someone who had endured pain and still chosen to create beauty. The art group became her second family. They reminded her that pain doesn't disappear, but it can be transformed. Every brushstroke was a release, every canvas a piece of her healing. She realized that by painting, she wasn't running from her trauma. She was facing it, naming it, and reshaping it into something meaningful. Her children noticed the change too. When they visited, they saw her paintings lined against the walls, bright and alive. "Mom, these are beautiful," her daughter said, her voice filled with pride. Margaret smiled, knowing they saw not just the art, but the strength behind it. In her 50s, when many people slowed down, Margaret was beginning again. She had faced her silence, broken through her fear, and embraced her truth. She wasn't chasing recognition or success. She was chasing wholeness. And with every canvas, she was finding it. But Margaret's journey was not over. The hardest part still waited for her at the decision to share her deepest truth. Not with strangers or fellow artists, but with her own family. She had told her story in colors and strokes, but could she find the courage to tell it with words? That question lingered in her heart as she packed away her brushes one evening. The gallery had given her confidence, William's words had given her hope, and her art group had given her community. But she knew the next step was bigger. To truly heal, she would have to open her heart completely. Margaret looked at the canvas drying in front of her painting of a woman standing under a sky full of stars. Small but unbroken. She touched the edge of the frame and whispered to herself, "One day, they will know." And with that, her turning point was complete. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer silent. She was ready for the final chapter of her journey. Storms, Margaret knew one truth. Silence would no longer define her. By the time Margaret reached her 70s, she was known in her family as the steady, gentle grandmother who always had tea ready and cookies warm from the oven. To her children and grandchildren, she seemed endlessly patient, endlessly kind. What they did not fully know was that she carried decades of silence, trauma, and dreams she had fought to keep alive. For years, she had expressed herself through her paintings, but she had never told her story with words. Deep inside, she knew it was time. One autumn evening, when the air outside carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, Margaret invited her grandchildren to her home. They gathered around her old wooden table, their faces glowing in the soft light of the lamp. The room smelled of cinnamon and apple pie. But beneath the sweetness was something heavier, a truth Margaret was ready to share. She poured each of them a cup of tea. her hands trembling slightly. The grandchildren, now teenagers and young adults, laughed and chatted about school, work, and their dreams. Margaret listened with a smile, but her heart beat quickly. She knew what she was about to say would change the way they saw her forever. When the laughter settled, she took a deep breath. "There's something I want you all to know," she began. The room grew quiet. They leaned closer, sensing the seriousness in her tone. She told them about her childhood, about the shadows she had carried, and about the fear that had silenced her for so many years. She didn't go into painful details. She chose her words carefully, speaking in a way they could understand without burdening them. She told them how she had buried her dreams, how she had lived for others while a part of her longed to be free. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on, determined not to hide anymore. The grandchildren sat wide-eyed. They had never imagined their grandmother as anything other than strong and unshakable. To hear her speak of fear and silence stunned them. But as she continued, their expressions shifted from shock to admiration. She told them how art had saved her, how picking up a brush had been like picking up her voice again. She explained how every canvas had carried a piece of her healing, and how standing in front of her paintings for the first time had made her feel seen. She spoke of William, their grandfather, how he had struggled to understand her, but had eventually stood quietly by her side. "He didn't always have the right words," she said softly, "but he gave me the space to be me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I want you to remember this," she told them, her voice firm despite the tremor. "Life will bring pain. Sometimes it will leave scars. But scars don't make you weak. They show that you survived. And no matter what happens, don't bury your dreams. Even if you set them aside for a while, don't forget them. Because one day those dreams might be the very thing that saves you." The grandchildren were silent for a long moment. Then the eldest, a young woman named Sarah, reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "Grandma," she whispered, "you're the bravest person I know." The others nodded, their eyes shining. To them, she was no longer just the sweet grandmother with cookies and stories. She was a fighter, a survivor, a woman who had endured pain but chosen love. That night changed the family forever. Margaret's truth gave them courage to face their own struggles. Her grandson, who had been quietly battling, later told her that her words had kept him from giving up on his dream of becoming a writer. Another grandchild began painting, inspired by her story of healing through art. Her honesty became a gift that rippled through generations. Margaret felt lighter after that night. She no longer carried her secrets alone. Her family knew her truth, and instead of pity, they gave her admiration. She realized that vulnerability had not weakened her, had made her stronger. As the years passed, her home filled with more laughter, more stories, and more art. Her grandchildren often asked to see her paintings, and she proudly showed them the canvases that once lived in hiding. They called her Grandma the Artist, a title that made her smile in her final years. Margaret spent her mornings in the garden, her afternoons painting by the window, and her evenings surrounded by family. She was no longer haunted by silence. She had turned her pain into color, her sorrow into lessons, her scars into stories. On her 81st birthday, the family surprised her by arranging a small exhibit at the local community center, a celebration of her life's work. The walls were lined with her paintings, from her earliest hidden sketches to her boldest, brightest canvases. People from the town came, young and old, to see the work of the woman they had known for years but had never truly understood. As Margaret stood in the center of the gallery, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and neighbors, she felt tears fill her eyes. Not because of the attention, but because she realized her life had come full circle. The little girl who once hid her dreams in drawers had finally been seen. In her heart, she whispered a quiet promise. "I lived, I healed, I loved, and I told my story." Margaret's legacy was not wealth or fame, it was courage. It was the reminder that silence can be broken, that dreams can return, that love can survive even when tested by time and pain. And when her grandchildren looked at her, they didn't just see a grandmother. They saw a woman who had overcome trauma, who had chosen hope, who had given them the greatest gift of all, the strength to face their own lives with honesty and courage. Margaret's story did not end with sorrow, it ended with light. She had taken the darkest parts of her past and turned them into colors that would shine long after she was gone.